We've now reached presentation 29 in the series where we're looking at the Gospel written by Matthew. Let's just look back for a moment. Jesus is teaching in the temple area and he told 3 parables. The summary of the parables is there. They all relate to the religious leadership of the time of Jesus. They'd missed out. And in the end, they were going to reject God's invitation in Jesus. They were going to seek to destroy and exterminate Jesus. But in the process, they were going to lose everything. Everything that they ever held dear. That's the danger. We can enter religious leadership with great commitment and enthusiasm, but it's too easy to end up running a religious system. And we lose the very purpose and the nature of the kingdom of God. And the Jewish leadership of that time, that era, they lost the lot. Their temple was gone. Their system was gone. Most of them lost their lives. The nation had gone. The Romans wiped it all out. By contrast, members of God's kingdom, Jesus is stressing that we come into God's kingdom without preconditions. God accepts you and me as we are. All he asks that we are willing to come in. We are seeking to make God king, to live the Jesus way. He provides the resources to make it possible. We have responsibilities. Responsibilities in God's kingdom by letting God be king, seeking to do it his way. We're allowing God to transform us. We come in as we are, and we allow God to transform us into what he wants us to be. There's a picture of the temple based on the magnificent model which is in Jerusalem today. Jesus was teaching probably in the temple area to the right center of the picture, that open area there. So he was teaching in the temple precincts, and there were crowds gathering around, and amongst the crowds were the religious leaders. And they realized, these religious leaders, just what Jesus was saying. And their hatred of him and resentment of him grew and grew. The last section finished with these words. When the chief priests and the Pharisees heard Jesus' parables, they knew he was talking about them. They looked for a way to arrest him, but they were afraid of the crowd because the people held that he was a prophet. Given that situation, what would you have done if you had been in the shoes of Jesus? Jesus knew what was going on. And it's all the more remarkable that Jesus had the courage, the honesty, the integrity, the willingness to tell the truth, even when the truth was going to cause him trouble. He stayed. He faced these religious leaders down. And in this presentation we're going to look at 3 questions they asked him. They were designed to trap him and catch him out, to make him lose face before the crowds round about. That was their goal. And there's quite a lot of that going on today. Posing questions to make somebody lose face. Almost every day we see it on our television screens. Jesus faced that with courage and integrity. So let's move on to the 4 questions. 3 questions were put to him, and then finally he put a question to them. Looking at the overall picture, the group that asked the questions was a combination of Pharisees and Herodians. We'll look at that in a moment. And it was about paying the Roman poll tax, much hated, which was applied to the Judea area of the country. Another religious group of leaders, Sadducees, concoct a story which is completely ludicrous. And it's supposed resurrection when they themselves didn't even believe that resurrection was possible. Comes back to the Pharisees, trying to catch Jesus out. What's the most important commandment? And then Jesus asks a question of the Pharisees about himself, the Messiah, challenging them to face up to the truth. Now let's look at these 4 groups: Sadducees, Herodians, Pharisees, and teachers of the law. We find mention of them scattered throughout the Gospel stories and indeed thereafter. You could describe the Sadducees that way, a kind of religious upper class. They often came in family groups. They were political collaborators with the Romans. They would take whatever line kept them in power. Theologically, they rejected any concept of resurrection. The word resurrection means a new body. So they rejected that. The Herodians were the group that loosely followed the ways of the Herod dynasty. You might describe them as religious liberals. They bent this way and that way to suit themselves, to keep themselves with power and influence. Very much ruled by politics, without much spiritual principle at all. We hear a lot about the Pharisees. We might regard them as the kind of religious middle class. They kept the orthodox religion going. They were experts in rule-keeping. They were the complete opposite of the Herodians. And then finally, the teachers of the law. In modern language, you could describe them as the religious civil service. They were students of the Old Testament, and they went through it extracting out the rules and then emphasizing it. So they worked often in collaboration with the Pharisees. That's the 4 religious groups and the leadership structure in the days of Jesus. Let's look at the first question, finding it in chapter 22. Then the Pharisees went out and laid plans to trap him in his words. They sent their disciples to him along with the Herodians. "Teacher," they said, "we know that you are a man of integrity and that you teach the way of God in accordance with the truth. You aren't swayed by others because you pay no attention to who they are. Tell us then, what is your opinion? Is it right to pay the poll tax to Caesar or not?" Blatant flattery. Opinion? Do we side truth on the basis of opinion? What about evidence? Jesus based his understandings on evidence. But Jesus, knowing their evil intent, said, "You hypocrites, why are you trying to trap me? Show me the coin used for paying the tax." They brought him a denarius, and he asked them, "Whose image is this, and whose inscription?" "Caesar's," they replied. Then he said to them, "So give back to Caesar what is Caesar's, and to God what is God's." When they heard this, they were amazed, so they left him and went away. They tried to make Jesus lose face in front of the crowds, to trap him. In the end, they went scuttled away with their tails between their legs. Now these 2 groups, They were unhappy bedfellows. They didn't agree about almost anything, and the very fact they came together to catch him out speaks of complete hypocrisy, which is the word Jesus used, hypocrite. They despised each other, and yet they conveniently combined forces to try and bring Jesus down. And they start with flattery and dishonesty. Now that was a Roman tax, had to be paid in the Roman currency, hence the denarius, and it was much hated. They'd introduced that some years before. It had not been popular. Part of the reason was they had to pay it in the Roman currency, and the silver denarius coin, which they had to use to pay it, had an inscription under the word emperor and described him as a son of a god. And for many in the Jewish leadership, that was just horrendous, an insult to God. We need to remember at that time that the Roman emperors, to increase their power base, referred to themselves as divine. Now, if Jesus had rejected payment, then he'd be coming against the Romans, and they could quite easily just remove him, wipe him out. If he accepted it, was he supporting the emperor called the Son of God? Now, when he asked for the coin, there's a very subtle point here. The fact that they could use one and they could happily produce the coin in the temple area, it all fits into the sheer hypocrisy of the leadership groups. There's a fundamental issue behind this. We can only just touch upon this. We're all members of society, and we have responsibilities as members of that society. How do we balance our loyalty to secular authorities and loyalty to God? Particularly when the secular authorities either are asking us or appear to be asking us to do things and demanding it, which poses problems. We've got to be very, very careful, cautious, and wise in this. Now, Jesus is making a clear principle here. Loyalty to God and loyalty to the emperor were both possible together. Loyalty to God and being full members of our societies today are still compatible. But there can be difficulties, and the practicalities of this are never easy. There can be conflicts, and they're not easy to define. Now, the problem is beginning to grow in the West, but it's present in totalitarian states today. And we've got to be very careful, thoughtful, and at the same time tolerant of each other if different followers of Jesus come to different conclusions. This is not easy, and we need to seek the wisdom of God in taking decisions. Let's move to question 2. Continues on in chapter 22. That same day, the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, now that's bodily resurrection, they came to him with a question. Teacher, they said, Moses told us that if a man dies without having children, his brother must marry the widow and raise up offspring for him. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first one married and died. Since he had no children, he left his wife to his brother. The The same thing happened to the second and the third, right down to the seventh. Finally, the woman died. Now then, at the resurrection, whose wife will she be of the seven, since all of them were married to her? Laughable, considering they didn't even accept that there was a resurrection. We'll look at that in a moment, what they did believe. Jesus replied, great wisdom, you are in error. Courage to say that to powerful religious leaders. You are in error, because you do not know the Scriptures or the power of God. At the resurrection, people will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They'll be like the angels in heaven, about the resurrection of the dead. Have you not read what God said to them? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. They held in very high regard Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the great patriarchs. And what Jesus is pointing out here is these great men of God. They're not dead, they're living. They have resurrected bodies, but they're living a spiritual existence. And God is their God. No wonder the crowd were astonished at his teaching. Now we kind of lose the impact of this. Sadducees were very, very powerful. There was a small number of them, and they held the total reins of power in the religious leadership and political leadership system of the Jewish nation at that time, particularly around Jerusalem. Jesus was taking them on, and he was saying to these people who were supposed to be the great religious leaders, you are in error. You don't know the Scriptures, that's the Old Testament, or the power of God. They bent the Scriptures to suit themselves, and they denied the supernatural power of God to intervene in the affairs of humanity. Quite a lot of that going on today. If you think about it for a moment, the story is ridiculous. Even with the difficulties at the time where illness could run through a family very quickly. But we've got to remember the context. In the culture of the time, women were seen as possessions. That's horrific. But it still occurs today. Women were possessions. There to serve men and to do what they were told. There was no welfare state. If a woman lost her husband, she had no means whatsoever of earning her livelihood. So the law, which goes back to Deuteronomy, was there to protect the widow. That's its purpose. Now the other thing we've got to remember is the context, that the Jews' concept of life after death, if you look throughout the entire Old Testament, there are no words in their language that describe hell as we use that word today. Now you may find the word hell in your Old Testament, but actually it's a mistranslation. The concepts of heaven and hell did not exist in the Jewish nation at that time. What they had was a very vague understanding of a shadowy place of the dead, and people were not separated. People died and they went to the shadowy place of the dead, which wasn't regarded very highly. They left this life, but they went on. Specifically, the Sadducees rejected any concept of resurrection, life being restored, and in some way life being restored in a physical body with a spiritual existence. The Pharisees were beginning to get to that, but the Sadducees didn't. And there was a big disagreement between the two groups. So we've got to be very careful. That shadowy place of the dead was the dominant thought of the time. Now let's look back to Deuteronomy. If brothers are living together, that's an if clause, and if one of them dies without a son, his widow must not marry outside the family. Her husband's brother shall take her and marry her and fulfill the duty of a brother-in-law to her. The first son she bears shall carry on the name of the dead brother, so that his name will not be blotted out from Israel. You see, because they didn't have any concept of life after death except this shadowy existence, they saw their reputation, their name, their life going on in their offspring. That's why having sons and daughters was so important. But this law was put in for a very practical reason. When a woman married, she was absorbed into the extended family of the husband, and they all lived in the same house very often. They lived together. She just moved out of her family house and joined her new husband's family house, perhaps with his parents and siblings and other families. Not easy. Now that occurs today in many parts of the world. But the principle is given here in Deuteronomy to protect women and provide for them in a society where women did not work to earn money. To protect them and provide for them. So it makes a lot of sense. And the other side of it is little concept of life after death. It's very vague. That's where Jesus came with a breakthrough when he showed us what it really was like. And people often saw their life going on in terms of the life of their offspring. And so a man having offspring was so important. So marriage and having children was so critical. And you can see examples in the Old Testament of great sadness when the children did not come. Now that's the background. Jesus is pretty brutal and blunt. He's accusing these powerful religious leaders who basically ran the nation. He's accusing them of ignorance. Ignorance of what the Old Testament actually means. That this principle is put there for the benefit of women. It makes sense. And it was a stinging rebuke for religious leadership. Basically, you don't know what you're talking about. We've got to be very, very cautious. Going into religious leadership does require that we do know what we're talking about. But they were ignorant of the power of God. They denied all elements of the supernatural. That's a strong element that you can see in the church in the West, even today, although it's beginning to die out. Too often we've reduced the way of Jesus to an intellectual, logical system. And we've lost the power of God. The power of God to change things, the power of God to answer prayer, the power of God in the miraculous. It can go on. The 20th century has seen a rediscovery of the power of God in the supernatural. And this has spread worldwide. But the Sadducees had made two bad mistakes. We must look at ourselves today and ask the question, are we making the same mistakes today? Now, let's just draw this question together. What Jesus is saying, what comes out of it, what's implied by this set of answers is death is not the end. It's a lot more than just a shadowy place of the dead. It isn't just you're buried, you're in a graveyard, you rot and you disappear and you're forgotten. But life after death is not the same as now. That's the point Jesus is making. It's not a continuation of the same, but it's a continuation in a way. It's a spiritual life after death, in resurrected bodies. And there's a deeper relationship with God after death. Jesus came to show and to teach the concept of resurrection life after death and give people hope. I am the resurrection and the life, he said. And he himself was resurrected. And that there is a miraculous power of God. He doesn't work by our human logical rules. He's not bound by our human theologies. There's much more to life after death than what we can deduce by our logic and our theologies. There are deep issues and questions implied in this question, but on to question 3. Hearing that Jesus had silenced the Sadducees, he'd just done that, the Pharisees now got together. One of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question: Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Now, in a sense, whatever answer he came up with, he was going to offend some group somewhere. They'd hoped he would lose face or stumble over this question. Jesus goes back to the Old Testament. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it. Love your neighbour as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments. The first is taken from Deuteronomy, the second from Leviticus. The phrase the law and the prophets means basically all the Old Testament writings which were in use at that time. Everything is built around these 2. These are the 2 great principles. The great principles that God has given to his people that they'd lost. Jesus brings them back and refocuses on these 2 great principles. Now we must look at the Pharisees in the context of their lifestyle and the culture of the time. They were very serious about their religion, and we must applaud them for it. They took it seriously and they studied hard. They worked at it. The problem was they were going in the wrong direction, but you couldn't fault their efforts. And many of them were seeking quality lives. But what they'd done is, in going the wrong direction, they'd taken the Old Testament and they'd codified all the laws. And they had not realized, and if you look at the language it's clear, that these laws are principles for the benefit of communities of God's people. They're not draconian laws which God imposes on us for his own purposes. They're there to help us, to guide us, but they're principles rather than a law code. But they'd codified it all down, and they then generated no less than 613 rules to be kept. You do this, you do that, you do the other, God will be pleased. Now that completely contorts what the Old Testament actually teaches and says. It contorts the very language of the Old Testament. They'd gone off in the wrong direction. We may laugh at that, but it's widespread today. You can see elements of it within the Christian churches, where there are certain rules that have to be kept. You have to do things this way, that way, the other way. Only this person can do this, that, and the other. And you look at the rituals that have evolved over the centuries, and they've now become a set of rules to be kept. And God will be pleased if we do it. And implicit in the way things are done is to become away from some gathering where we've kept the rules with a kind of good feeling that satisfied God. Utter perversion of what the Old Testament, indeed the whole Bible, is all about. Now they argued about the rules, which is why this question was brought up, because whichever way Jesus went, he was going to cause a disturbance, disagreements. They were trying to bring him down and make him lose face. Could they catch Jesus out? Now, if you look at Islam today, Islamic scholarship rigorously analyzes the Quran and the Hadith, the sayings of the Prophet, and sets up the rule systems and the relative importance of the rules and how they must be applied today and how they can be interpreted today. And so 7th century rules are being interpreted into 21st century society. And there's arguments about which rules are important, which causes some of the divisions between Islamic groups today. It also just brings about the extremist groups who take a particular line in interpreting the rules. But could they catch Jesus out? Could they make him generate disagreement where they could take sides and there would be a great argument and Jesus would lose face in front of the crowd? Because disagreement undermines authority. It always does. That's one of the tragedies of the disagreements across the Christian churches. We're just playing theological games. But in the process, we're destroying the reputation of Jesus in the marketplace of life. There's much to be learned from the context of the Pharisees. Jesus brings it down to two great principles: loving God with every part of our being and loving others as much as we love ourselves. Now we've got to watch that word love. Let me put in a meaning of these. That one leads. And that's the evidence that we love God. When we love God, it leads to us seeing others in a different way. When we love others, that's the evidence that we're loving God. But what does love mean? I put it in simple, practical language. The word that's used, love, is not a word with any emotional content. It's not a warm feeling. There's a different word in the original language for that. Love means putting God first, irrespective of the cost to ourselves. We're seeking to live His way. God is love, and He seeks the best for us, so what a benefit it is to us all. Now that reflects itself in the meaning of loving others. It's not a warm feeling, it's not liking, it's not emotion. Love is action. It means putting others first, irrespective of the cost to ourselves. And the cost may be very large. Now it's worth just looking at that frame, maybe writing down these phrases and pondering this through. There are extremely deep thoughts here. I've put it that way. Love moves the agenda outside of ourselves. In everything, we're seeking the benefit of the other person. Jesus has got right to the heart and the core of the message He came to bring. God is love. His agenda is the best for you and me. When we love God, it means that we're saying, I want to live my life God's way. And when we love others, that's an outworking of it. That everything we do, say and think is done seeking the benefit of the other. Very, very deep thoughts in the answer that Jesus gives. You see, this rule book mentality that the Pharisees exemplified so completely, it's the way of all religion. Oh, how we develop religions and we set up rule systems. The way of Jesus is completely different. We respond to God's love. If you think about it, keeping rules to impress God is just selfishness. We're trying to book our meal ticket to paradise. The way of Jesus focuses on love, where everything we do focuses on the best for the other. It's radically different, and that's the difference between the way of Jesus and the way of all religion. But this way of religion pervades the thinking of our society. And you'll see it and hear it in society. When some disaster happens to a person or to a family, they immediately are starting to think, even if they don't have any great spiritual commitments, God must be angry with me, I've done something wrong, I haven't kept the rules. Religion sets its priorities by keeping rules. And there are people who set these up, impose them, and seek to keep them. Pharisees and the teachers of the law in the days of Jesus, if you like, Islamic scholars today. God sets his priorities by the best interests of the other. If you ponder it, if we all did this, what a wonderful humanity we would have. That's what God's seeking to have for us. We're seeking to meet the deepest needs of the other. No matter what the cost. It cost God everything to seek to meet the needs of humanity. Rule keeping is negative. Jesus throws it out. Religion is a human thing. He brings in the positive concept of love. That's God's way of righteousness. Quality living. Individually, but in communities, societies, nations, internationally. He has lifted the whole issue to a much higher level. And there's so much that we need to ponder through for ourselves, for our communities, for our Christian communities, for societies, for cultures, and indeed right across into politics and leadership. Fundamental principles here. Loving the Lord our God with every part of our being defines our relationship with God. And loving our neighbour as ourselves defines our relationship with everyone with whom we have any contact. Very deep issues touched upon by Jesus. No wonder the crowds rocked back. And that leads us to the question he posed to them now. When the Pharisees were gathered together, Jesus asked them, "What do you think about the Messiah? Whose son is he?" "The son of David," they replied. Now that's sound logic. The Old Testament teaches quite clearly that there would come from the line of kings descended from David a ruler who would set up a permanent kingdom. This was the picture of the Messiah they had. They got a lot of it wrong, but this bit they'd got right. But then Jesus says to them, how is it that David, speaking by the Spirit, calls him Lord. That's his descendant. For he says, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. Now that's taken from Psalm 110 and the first verse. If then David calls him, that's his descendant, Lord, how can he be his son, his descendant? No one could say a word in reply, and from that day on no one dared to ask him any more questions. He poses them a question which challenges the root issue right at the center of things. Now the word Messiah just comes straight from the Hebrew language. Christ is the Greek word that means exactly the same. It's just translation. And they mean the sent one of God. What do you think about the sent one of God? The one who's coming to transform things, to set up the permanent kingdom. Son means a descendant. And that's repeated in many places in the Old Testament, that would come from the line of David, a descendant, who, unlike the kings of the time, this descendant would be the perfect king, setting up the permanent kingdom. So the Messiah is a descendant of David, and yet David calls him my Lord. In other words, he's superior to David, and yet he's a descendant of David. Jesus poses that conundrum and question to them. Put it side by side. How is it then that David, speaking by the Spirit, which certainly gives the Old Testament authority, calls him Lord? The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. Now you've noticed that the two words Lord, one's in capitals and one has just got one capital. It's because it's two different words in the original language. The word there is the word that's always used of God. God said to my Lord, that's the Messiah, the descendant of David. But he's my Lord, says David. And God saying to the one, the Messiah, the coming one, the sent one of God, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies a footstool for your feet. You're going to be the Lord and the King of glory over everybody and all nations and all peoples. But David is calling his descendant my Lord. How could it possibly be true? And yet it is true. Jesus, as the adopted son of Joseph, remember Joseph took Jesus and he named him as Jesus. In the culture of the time, that was accepting Jesus as his adopted son. Adoption gave the son all the rights of the family under the laws of the time. Jesus is a descendant of David, and yet Jesus, with all the fullness of God resting on him, is the Son of God, and therefore superior to David, and therefore David could call him my Lord. Jesus, human. Jesus, God. God entered our humanity, limiting himself in the life of a human being to deal with the root problem of humanity, our rebellion against God, our unwillingness to live his ways. It's all logical. It's all meaningful. But the Pharisees and the people there couldn't get it, or chose not to get it. You see, it comes back to the most fundamental question of all, how we see Jesus. So often we've seen Jesus, and this is how media presents Jesus as the founder of a religion. He never founded any religion. That's a human artifact. Jesus made a mistake and ended up being executed in humiliation. Jesus is a human being. He was. But so often the miraculous power of Jesus is ignored or explained away by playing our theological games. How do we see Jesus? Let's look at the evidence from history, from the documents, quite apart from the New Testament. He was totally human, but he was totally divine. How could he do what he did without the total power of God upon him? We need to look at the evidence, not opinion, not theological games. Look at the evidence. He was a descendant of David. That's just a fact. And yet he's the Lord of David because he's God who came in human flesh. Bringing it together. Jesus stayed in the temple area and faced down the religious leaders. They asked questions designed to trap him and catch him out. He faced up to it. It took courage, integrity, honesty. He spoke the truth. And no one could say a word in reply and from that day on, no one dared to ask him any more questions. That's the religious leaders. They realized they were no match for him. Their homespun theologies didn't come up to the mark. But they still wanted to get rid of him because Jesus disturbed their cozy lifestyle. The religious establishment was defeated and they knew it. They'd lost face before the crowd. And leaders never like to lose face before the led. So they were starting to plot for his extermination. In the next presentation, we're going to look at what Jesus thought about it all. Because Jesus now comments and describes these experiences that he's been through with religious leaders. And the verdict is sad and devastating.